The morning of September 14th, 1943, broke cold and gray over the steppe near Kharkov. A thin frost had settled overnight on the blackened grass, and the air smelled of diesel exhaust, cordite, and something else. Something sweet and wrong. The way a battlefield always smells after the guns have stopped and the crows have not yet arrived. Hauptmann Werner Dietz stood at the edge of the improvised airstrip and pulled his leather flight jacket tighter against the chill. He was 31 years old, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, the French campaign, the Battle of Britain, and 2 full years on the Eastern Front. He had flown the Messerschmitt B F-109 in every variant from the Emil to the Gustav, and he had shot down 22 aircraft. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the finest fighter pilots in Jagdgeschwader 52. And yet, for the past 6 months, something had been eating at him with the persistence of a slow infection. The Soviets were getting better. Not just better pilots, though that too was undeniable. The men the Red Air Force was producing in 43 were nothing like the stunned and confused airmen of 41, who had flown outdated machines in rigid formations and died in their thousands. These new men flew aggressively, used the terrain, chose their moments. But more than the men, it was the machines. Specifically, it was one machine. The Americans called it the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Dietz had first encountered it over the Kuban Peninsula in the spring of that year, during the brutal air battles that the Luftwaffe pilots were already calling the Kuban meat grinder. He had come down on a pair of Soviet fighters from above and behind, the classic high-side attack that had served him so well for years. He expected the Soviets to break left, as they almost always did. Instead, one of them, he saw the Red Star clearly, saw the unusual profile of the aircraft with its tricycle undercarriage and the strange mid-fuselage engine, had turned into him with a radius that seemed physically impossible. The G-forces involved in that turn should have blackened a man's vision, and yet the Soviet pilot had pulled it cleanly and sent a burst of cannon fire close enough to punch 3 holes in Dietz's tail section. He had broken off the engagement and climbed away, which the P-39 could not follow. That much remained true. The American aircraft lost badly at altitude. But below 4,000 meters, below the altitude where the supercharger on its Allison engine was supposed to compensate for the thinner air and simply did not, the Airacobra was something genuinely dangerous. Down low, over the steppe and the river crossings and the burning villages, it was fast, it was agile, and it carried a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub that could tear a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt apart with a single, clean burst. The Americans had rejected the aircraft. Dietz knew this. German intelligence had circulated documents captured from various sources, making this embarrassing fact quite clear. The United States Army Air Forces had found the P-39 unsuitable for their needs. Too slow at altitude, the supercharger arrangement inadequate for the kind of high-altitude bomber escort work they required. They had shipped thousands of them to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, essentially offloading a problem aircraft onto an ally who needed anything with wings. The Soviets had taken this gift and made it into something terrifying. Dietz was thinking about all of this when Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann came running across the frost-whitened grass with the expression of a man who has either witnessed a miracle or is about to deliver catastrophically bad news. With Hartmann, Dietz had learned over the past 2 years it was rarely possible to tell which until the man opened his mouth. "Herr Hauptmann," Hartmann said, coming to a halt and breathing hard. He had clearly run some distance. "You need to come with me, right now. Gerstner's flight found something." "Found what?" "An Airacobra, Herr Hauptmann, intact. Well, nearly intact. It went down in the marsh east of Malaya Rohan. The pilot was dead when they reached him. The aircraft is damaged, but the airframe is essentially whole. Major Brandt is already on his way, and he's requesting that you—" "Get the Kubelwagen," Dietz said. The drive took 40 minutes over roads that had been churned to mud by tank treads and then partially frozen again, creating a surface that felt like driving over a series of small tombstones. Dietz said nothing during the journey. He sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and thought about the turn radius. The impossible turn radius. The marsh was a flat, dead place, its reeds broken and brown, ice forming in the shallow standing water around the tussocks. The aircraft sat on a low hammock of firmer ground, its nose buried slightly in the soft earth, one wing tilted toward the sky at an angle that gave it a strange, wounded quality, like a bird with a broken wing trying still to lift itself. The red stars on the fuselage were bright even in the gray morning light. The canopy was open. Hartman had said the pilot was dead, and someone had obviously already checked, and the cockpit was visible, small and cramped in a way that surprised Dietz each time he saw it. What struck him first, as it always did, was the door. The P-39 had an automobile-style door on each side of the cockpit, hinged at the front, opening outward. It was one of the aircraft's most distinctive and peculiar features. The first time Dietz had seen it described in an intelligence report, he had assumed the translator had made an error.
No aircraft had doors like that. Aircraft had sliding or hinged canopies. The door arrangement implied something about the interior layout of the machine, something that nagged at him now as he walked slowly around the wreck, his boots crunching on the frost. Major Friedrich Brandt was already there, standing beside the aircraft with a notebook and a pair of reading glasses that he wore with the slightly embarrassed air of a man who has recently been forced to admit that his eyesight is not what it was. Brandt was the senior technical officer for the Gruppe, a former engineer who had come to the Luftwaffe through a different door than most. He had worked at the Heinkel plant in Rostock before the war, and understood aircraft not as instruments of glory or machines of combat, but as collections of engineering problems and their solutions. "Dietz," he said, without looking up from his notebook, "come look at this." Dietz came around the nose of the aircraft and stood beside Brandt, looking at what the major was indicating with his pencil. The engine access panels on the rear fuselage, behind the cockpit, which was itself already unusual, already indicative of the layout that had been puzzling him, were partially open. One of them had been damaged in the landing and hung at an angle. Through the gap, Dietz could see machinery. The Allison V1710 engine, mounted amidships, behind the pilot and ahead of the tail surfaces. "They put the engine in the middle," Dietz said. "Behind the cockpit," Brandt confirmed. "The propeller shaft runs forward under the pilot's feet. The cannon fires through the hub. The engine is essentially where a second cockpit would be in a two-seat aircraft." He paused, tapping his pencil against his notebook. "Do you understand what that does to the weight distribution?" Dietz looked at the aircraft again. He had known this, had read it in the reports, had understood it intellectually. But standing here, looking at the actual machine, at the compactness of the nose section, at the way the weight was balanced, he began to understand it differently. Not as information, but as engineering, as intent. "The nose is light," he said slowly. "The nose is extremely light," Brandt said. "The cannon, yes, but no engine. No engine cowling, no cylinders, no oil lines running forward. The center of gravity is well aft by the standards of conventional aircraft. And the undercarriage." He pointed to the nose wheel, the tricycle arrangement that was itself still unusual in a world where most fighters still use the old tail wheel configuration. A nosewheel aircraft sits level on the ground. When it flies, it does not need to pitch the nose up to generate lift in the way a tailwheel aircraft does. The aerodynamic line is cleaner at lower angles of attack. Dietz stood in the cold marsh and looked at the dead aircraft and felt something shift in his understanding. It was not a large shift. It was the kind of small, precise movement that happens when a key turns in a lock. "We need to get it back," he said. "All of it. Every piece." Brandt was already writing in his notebook. "I have already sent for a recovery team," he said, "and I have requested authorization to transport it to the technical evaluation facility at Rechlin." He looked up over his reading glasses. "There is something else, Dietz. Something I noticed when I looked in the cockpit." "What?" "The gun sight.
Come and look at the gun sight. The Erprobungsstelle Rechlin sat on the southern shore of the Müritz Lake in Mecklenburg, a facility that most Germans had never heard of and that the Allied intelligence services had been trying to understand fully for several years. It was the Luftwaffe's primary flight test and evaluation center, the place where new aircraft were wrung out before they entered service, where captured enemy machines were dissected and assessed, and where the quiet, careful work of understanding what the other side was doing proceeded with the methodical patience of men who knew that the answer to any technical question might eventually cost or save thousands of lives. Dietz arrived there on the evening of September 22nd, 8 days after the recovery team had extracted the damaged Airacobra from the marsh near Malaya Rohan and loaded it onto a series of flatbed railway wagons for the long journey west. The aircraft had been partially disassembled for transport, the wings removed, the tail surfaces detached, and it had traveled wrapped in tarpaulins, like something precious and slightly shameful, a secret being moved through a world full of curious eyes. The facility was larger than Dietz had expected. He had been here once before, briefly, in 1941, when the Bf-109F was being evaluated, and he had been brought in as one of several operational pilots to provide feedback on handling characteristics. But that visit had been short and focused, and he had not seen the full extent of the place. The hangars, the machine shops, the long administrative buildings where the engineers and scientists worked, the test runway that stretched along the lakeshore in the gray autumn light. Major Brandt had preceded him by 2 days and met him at the entrance to Hangar 7 with the expression of a man who has recently eaten something that surprised him. "It is even more interesting than I thought," Brandt said, by way of greeting. "Show me." The aircraft was laid out on the hangar floor in a way that reminded Dietz, with a slight unease he did not fully acknowledge, of an autopsy. The fuselage was on trestles. The wings were propped against the hangar wall. Various panels had been removed and set aside in labeled groups, and a team of perhaps 12 men, engineers, draftsmen, a photographer with a large format camera on a tripod, moved around the components with the focused, slightly reverent air of specialists confronting something that demands their full attention. Oberingenieur Hans Mertens, the senior engineer assigned to the evaluation, was a small, precise man in his late 40s who wore his Luftwaffe uniform as though it were a slightly ill-fitting suit he had borrowed for an important occasion. He had the distracted courtesy of someone whose mind is perpetually engaged with problems that have nothing to do with social interaction, and he shook Dietz's hand while looking at a technical drawing rather than at Dietz's face. "Hauptmann Dietz," he said. "Good. Brandt told me you have operational experience against this aircraft. I have questions for you." He finally looked up. "But first, have you eaten? No? Good. Come and look at this while you are still hungry. You will find it easier to concentrate." This logic was not immediately apparent to Dietz, but he followed Mertens to the center of the hangar where the fuselage sat on its trestles, opened and exposed in a way that felt almost indecent. What Mertens showed him first was the drive shaft. In a conventional piston-engine fighter, the relationship between engine and propeller is direct and simple. The engine sits in the nose, the propeller attaches to the engine's crankshaft. The whole arrangement is as self-evidently logical as a hammer. The P-39's arrangement was nothing like this. The Allison engine sat behind the cockpit, its crankshaft pointing forward. A drive shaft, an extension shaft nearly 3 meters long, running forward through the cockpit floor, under the pilot's seat and between his feet, connected the engine to the propeller reduction gearbox mounted in the nose. The 37mm M4 cannon was also mounted in the nose, its barrel passing through the hollow propeller shaft hub, its breech in the cockpit directly in front of the pilot's face. "The shaft," Mertens said, pointing with a wooden pointer that he carried with the ease of a schoolteacher who has used such implements his entire life. "Look at the diameter. Look at the support bearings here, and here, and here." He indicated 3 points along the shaft's length. This is not a simple engineering solution. This is an expensive, complex, carefully calculated engineering solution. Someone at Bell Aircraft Corporation spent a very long time thinking about this. But why? Dietz asked, though he was beginning to form his own answer. Weight distribution, Brandt said from behind him. As I said at the marsh. More than weight distribution, Mertens corrected, gently but firmly, in the manner of a man who has been gently but firmly correcting people his entire career. Weight distribution is the consequence, the purpose. He walked to a chalkboard that had been set up near the trestles and picked up a piece of chalk. In a few quick lines, he drew the outline of a conventional fighter aircraft, engine in nose, pilot behind. In a conventional layout, the heaviest single component, the engine, is at the extreme forward end of the aircraft. This creates a strong nose-down pitching moment. The tail surfaces must generate significant downforce to balance this. The tail surfaces must therefore be large, or the moment arm between tail and wing must be long, or both. He drew a second outline beside the first, the distinctive profile of the Airacobra with its mid-mounted engine. Move the engine to the center, and the pitching moment is dramatically reduced. The tail surfaces can be smaller. The aircraft is more responsive in pitch. It recovers from unusual attitudes more quickly, and... He paused, tapping the chalk against the board. The roll rate.
Tell me, Hauptmann, when you encountered this aircraft in combat, what was its roll rate at low altitude?
Dietz thought about the engagement over the Kuban. Extremely high, he said. At low altitude, below 3,000 meters, the roll rate was comparable to the Gustav, and possibly better. Mertens nodded as though he had expected exactly this answer. Because the engine, the heaviest component, is near the roll axis, the moment of inertia in roll is dramatically reduced compared to a conventional aircraft. Less mass at the extremes means less energy required to initiate a roll. He set down the chalk. Whoever designed this aircraft was not trying to make a conventional fighter. They were trying to solve a specific set of aerodynamic problems, and they chose an unconventional solution. The photographer was moving around the cockpit area, his flash gun firing at intervals, the sharp white light throwing everything into sudden relief before the shadows returned. Dietz watched him for a moment and then climbed the small ladder that had been positioned beside the trestles and looked into the open cockpit. It was, as he had noted from outside, cramped. But it was also coherent in a way that surprised him. The instrument layout was logical, the controls well placed. The gun sight, the item Brandt had mentioned in the marsh, was positioned directly in front of the pilot's face, and Dietz could now see what Brandt had found notable about it. It was a reflector gun sight of a type he did not immediately recognize, and someone, the Soviet pilot who had last flown this aircraft presumably, had made several careful pencil marks on the glass and on the surrounding frame. Range markings, target wingspan calibrations. He was ranging his shots, Dietz said. Very carefully, Brandt confirmed, climbing up beside him.
Look at the calculations on the notepad. He pointed to a small writing surface mounted to the left of the instrument panel, where a folded piece of paper was clipped. On it, in pencil, in Cyrillic script, were columns of figures. Our translator is working on the text, but the numbers are clear enough. He was calculating optimal firing ranges for the cannon against different target types. Fighter aircraft, bombers. He had worked out the lead angles at various closure rates. Dietz looked at the figures for a long time. The dead Soviet pilot, whom he would never know, and whose name he did not yet know, had sat in this cockpit and done mathematics. Had treated the business of killing as a problem in applied geometry, which was, of course, exactly what it was, and had been thorough and careful and professional about it. What do we know about who was flying it? Dietz asked. Guards regiment marking, Brandt said. The number on the fuselage corresponds to a unit we have identified as part of the 16th Air Army. Alexander Pokrishkin's outfit. He paused. Pokrishkin is their leading ace. His men are considered their best. This was not news that made Dietz feel better, but it confirmed what he had suspected. The Soviets were not winning with the Airacobra by accident or by numbers alone. They were winning because they had taken an aircraft the Americans had considered inadequate
had understood it on its own terms rather than comparing it to what they expected a fighter to be, and had built around it a doctrine of combat that played to its genuine strengths. Low-altitude speed, roll rate, firepower, and the brutal simplicity of a 37mm cannon that required only 1 or 2 hits to destroy any aircraft the Luftwaffe was flying. Mertens had come to stand beside the trestles again and was looking up at the 2 men in the cockpit with the expression of someone about to deliver the most important part of a lecture. "There is one more thing," he said.
"Come down and look at the cannon installation." The M4 cannon was laid out on a separate workbench, field-stripped to its major components. Mertens led Dietz to it and stood back, allowing him to look. 37mm, Dietz said. 37mm, Mertens confirmed. The same caliber as our Bordkanone 37, which we mount externally under the wings of certain variants of the Stuka and the Bf-109. Now, look at how it is mounted in the Airacobra. Through the hub, on the aircraft's centerline. The gun does not create asymmetric drag. It does not disturb the airflow over the wing. And the recoil! He picked up a diagram from the workbench, a cross-section drawing that his men had made. The recoil forces act directly on the aircraft's longitudinal axis. There is no yawing moment. The pilot can fire this cannon in a turning engagement without the gun trying to rotate the aircraft around its vertical axis. He set the drawing down. Our 37mm installations create significant yaw on firing. The pilot must compensate. At high deflection angles, in a turning engagement, this is... He searched for the right word. "Impossible," Dietz said. "Extremely difficult," Mertens said, because he was not a man who used the word impossible lightly. "The Americans solved this problem before we did, and they did not even want the solution." The hangar was quiet for a moment, except for the sound of the photographer's flash gun and the scratch of draftsmen's pencils. "How long will the full evaluation take?" Dietz asked. Mertens considered. "If we are thorough, and we must be thorough, 4 weeks, perhaps 6. We will attempt to fly it once repairs are complete. The damage to the undercarriage and the forward fuselage is repairable. The engine appears functional." He paused. "I have requested the full Lend-Lease documentation from our intelligence liaison. I want to know the production figures. I want to know how many of these aircraft the Americans have sent east." Dietz already knew the answer was in the thousands. He did not say so. He walked back to the fuselage and stood looking at it in silence for a while. At the red stars that were still bright even under the hangar lights, at the automobile door that hung slightly open on its hinge, at the hollow nose where the cannon barrel protruded like an accusation. Someone at Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York, had sat at a drawing board in... when? 1937? 38? And had looked at the problem of designing a fighter aircraft from a different angle than everyone else. Had said, what if the engine were not in the nose? And from that single question, posed in peacetime by men who could not have known where the answer would eventually be used or by whom, had come the thing on the trestles before him. The thing that was killing his colleagues over the steppes of the Soviet Union. 4 weeks, he said. Start tomorrow. The repairs took 11 days. Oberingenieur Mertens drove his team with the quiet relentlessness of a man who measures time in problems solved rather than hours passed. The undercarriage damage was the most serious issue. The nose wheel strut had buckled on landing, and fabricating a replacement required machining work that consumed 4 full days. The forward fuselage skin had been patched with German aluminum sheet, slightly thicker than the original American material, which Mertens noted in his report with the precision of a man who considers every deviation from specification potentially significant. The Allison V1710 engine, when the mechanics finally turned it over by hand and then on the starter, caught on the 3rd attempt and ran with a sound that was different from anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. A deeper, smoother note than the Daimler-Benz or Junkers Umo engines Dietz knew. Less mechanical urgency, almost contemplative. One of the young mechanics stood listening to it, with his head tilted slightly, the way a musician listens to an unfamiliar instrument. The question of who would fly it was settled quickly. Rechlin had several test pilots on permanent assignment, but for a captured enemy aircraft, the evaluation required someone with genuine combat experience against the type. Dietz was the obvious choice. He had 17 hours in the Bf-109G, 8 in the Focke-Wulf 190, and 2 in a captured Hurricane that had briefly passed through the facility in 42. He had never flown a tricycle undercarriage aircraft. Merton spent an afternoon briefing him on the differences. "You will not feel the tailwheel lift as you accelerate," Merton said, drawing diagrams with his habitual chalk. "The aircraft is already in the flying attitude on the ground. When you have sufficient airspeed, it will simply rise. Do not try to rotate it. It will tell you when it is ready." He paused. "The view forward on the ground is extraordinary. You will feel as though you are sitting in an automobile." "I have been told there are actual automobile components in the design," Dietz said. "The door hinges," Mertens confirmed without irony. "Bell sourced them from a production line that also supplied civilian vehicles. It was a cost and complexity reduction decision, perfectly logical." He said this in a tone that suggested he found it both admirable and slightly offensive. The morning chosen for the test flight was October the 9th, cold and clear, the Muritz Lake glittering to the north, the test runway swept clean of frost. The Airacobra sat on the apron in the thin sunlight, repainted with Luftwaffe crosses over the Soviet red stars, a requirement of the evaluation protocol in case any German aircraft or anti-aircraft positions encountered it during the flight. The crosses looked wrong on it. The aircraft seemed to resist the new identity. Dietz climbed in through the automobile door, which opened with a solidity that surprised him. It was a well-made door, tightly fitted, with a positive latch that engaged cleanly. He settled into the seat, which was positioned differently than he was used to, more upright, the rudder pedals further forward. He could see the entire runway ahead of him without raising his head, without craning around the cowling of an engine that was not there. The cannon breech sat directly in front of his face, between the instrument panel and the reflector gun sight. It was a large mechanical presence, and in the first moments of sitting in the cockpit, it seemed aggressive, intrusive, too close. Then he understood it. The cannon was not in front of his face because someone had run out of space. It was in front of his face because it was the primary weapon, the reason the aircraft existed, and the designer had arranged everything else around it rather than treating it as an afterthought bolted to an already complete airframe. He started the engine, went through the checklist that Mertens had prepared in German, taxied to the runway threshold. The takeoff was unlike anything he had experienced. The aircraft accelerated cleanly, tracking straight down the centerline without the pronounced swing that every tailwheel fighter required constant right rudder to correct. At 160 kilometers per hour, it rose from the runway without drama, without the characteristic lurch that came from rotating a tailwheel aircraft. It simply became airborne, as though the transition between ground and air were a matter of administrative procedure rather than physical effort. He climbed to 2,000 meters and leveled off. The first thing he did was a roll. He applied aileron, and the aircraft snapped around its longitudinal axis with a sharpness that pressed him against the side of the cockpit and made him breathe out hard. The roll rate was, as Mertens had predicted, exceptional. He did 3 more in quick succession, alternating directions, feeling the way the aircraft recovered and stabilized, the way it wanted to continue rolling once started, and yet stopped cleanly when he neutralized the controls. Then he pulled back on the stick and entered a tight turn, loading up the G-forces, watching the horizon rotate, feeling the airframe tighten around him as the wings bit into the air. The turn radius. He understood it now. Not as a statistic in a report or a surprise in combat, but as a physical reality transmitted through the seat of his flight suit. The aircraft turned inside its own shadow, impossibly tight for its speed, because the engine in the center meant the wings were unencumbered by the weight and drag of forward-mounted machinery, because the control surfaces were responsive in a way that went beyond mere adjustment. They were conversations between pilot and aircraft, quick and honest. He spent 40 minutes in the air. He flew at 3,000 meters and confirmed the power falling off,
the Allison struggling without the supercharger boost that might have transformed it. He flew low, 200 meters above the lake surface, and felt the aircraft come alive in a way that made him understand, viscerally and finally, why Soviet pilots were winning engagements that by all previous logic they should have been losing. Below 3,000 meters, this aircraft was a weapon refined to its purpose, with a clarity that was almost philosophical. It had been built for one thing: to fly low, to turn hard, to fire one devastating cannon burst at close range. And every compromise, every limitation at altitude, every mechanical complexity of the driveshaft arrangement was the price paid for that single excellence. He landed, taxied back, opened the automobile door, and climbed out onto the wing. Mertens was waiting with his notebook. "Well?" the engineer said.
Dietz stood on the wing for a moment, looking back along the fuselage at the engine access panels, at the place where the Allison sat in its unusual home. "The Americans did not fail to make a good aircraft," he said. "They made a different aircraft than they needed. The Soviets needed exactly this one." Mertens wrote something in his notebook. "And the cannon?" "I did not fire it, but I do not need to." Dietz climbed down from the wing. "Write in your report that any engagement with a P-39 below 3,000 meters at close range in a turning fight should be avoided. Tell them to stay high. Tell them to use the altitude advantage and never surrender it." He paused. "And tell them that if the pilot in that cockpit is good, even altitude may not be enough." Mertens looked up from his notebook. It was the most alarmed expression Dietz had ever seen on the engineer's careful face. The formal evaluation report was completed on October 28, 1943. It ran to 67 pages of technical documentation, photographs, engineering drawings, and operational analysis. Mertens had written most of it himself, in the dense, precise German of a man who believes that every unnecessary word is a form of professional dishonesty. Dietz had contributed 12 pages of operational commentary. The report was classified at the highest level available to the Rechlin facility, and copies were dispatched to the Reich Aviation Ministry, to the technical departments of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, and to the operational commands on the Eastern Front. What happened to those copies was, in the way of large bureaucracies fighting desperate wars, somewhat less orderly than the process that had produced them. Dietz knew this because he stayed at Rechlin through the end of October, formally assigned as a liaison between the evaluation team and the operational commands, unofficially because he found he could not simply leave. The aircraft had taken hold of some part of his thinking that he could not easily release. He spent his evenings in the officers' mess reading the technical sections of Mertens' report, not because he understood the engineering fully, but because understanding it partially was more troubling than not understanding it at all. The core finding of the report was stated plainly on its third page, in a summary that Mertens had written and rewritten several times until it said precisely what he meant and nothing else. Dietz had watched him write it and had read it so many times he could recite it from memory. The Bell P-39 Airacobra represents a coherent and deliberately executed engineering solution to the problem of low-altitude air combat. Its limitations at altitude are real and significant. Its capabilities below 3,000 meters are equally real and have been systematically underestimated by German operational commands. The aircraft's center-mounted engine configuration produces handling characteristics, particularly in roll and in tight turning, that are superior to current German fighter types at low altitude. The centerline cannon installation eliminates the asymmetric firing problems associated with wing-mounted or underwing heavy-caliber weapons. Soviet pilots have demonstrated a thorough understanding of how to exploit these characteristics. German pilots have not demonstrated an equivalent understanding of how to counter them. Reading this on a Tuesday evening in the mess, with rain on the windows and a glass of indifferent brandy at his elbow, Dietz thought about the Soviet pilot whose pencil calculations had survived him. The columns of figures on the notepad clipped to the left of the instrument panel. Lead angles, firing ranges, target dimensions.
a man who had treated his aircraft as a precision instrument and himself as its most important component, and had invested the intellectual effort that precision required. The Germans had been fighting the war in the East with a conviction, not always stated, but always present, that technical superiority was their natural condition. The early years had supported this conviction. The Bf-109 had been genuinely better than most of what opposed it in 41 and 42. But the conviction had become a habit of mind, and habits of mind, Dietz was coming to understand, were dangerous in proportion to how comfortable they made you feel. The Airacobra was not a German aircraft. It was not even, strictly speaking, an American aircraft in the sense that Americans were using it. It was something the Americans had decided they did not want, and the Soviets had decided they understood. And the gap between those two decisions, between rejection and comprehension, had become a gap that was costing the Luftwaffe pilots and aircraft over the burning steppe. Mertens came to find him on the evening of November the 2nd, carrying a second copy of the report and looking more troubled than usual. "I have received a response from the ministry," he said, sitting down without being asked, which was unusual enough to be immediately alarming. "They have reviewed the summary findings." "And?" "They are concerned about the implications for the Bf-109 production program." Mertens set the report on the table between them. "The report recommends developing a dedicated low-altitude variant of the Gustav with a modified supercharger optimized for performance below 3,000 meters. The ministry's position is that this would require retooling that cannot be accommodated at the current stage of production." Dietz looked at him. "They are rejecting the recommendation?" "They are deferring it. There is a distinction, technically." "Is there?" Mertens was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming on the roof of the mess building with an energy that seemed almost pointed. "The Focke-Wulf section received the report," he said. "Kurt Tank's people. They have indicated interest in the center of gravity findings as they relate to a project they are already developing. The Ta-152, possibly. Or something related." He paused. "So it is not without effect." This was something. Tank was a serious engineer, the kind of man who would look at the Airacobra's weight distribution data and immediately understand its implications for his own work. If the Bell aircraft's unconventional layout caused even one German designer to question one assumption about where heavy components should be placed, the evaluation had served a purpose beyond its immediate operational recommendations. But Dietz found himself thinking about the timeline. Tank's projects took years from concept to production. The war on the Eastern Front was being fought now, this autumn, this winter, over ground that was freezing again as it had frozen in 41 and 42. The pilots who needed to understand how to fight the Airacobra were flying missions tomorrow morning, not in 2 years. "The operational recommendations," he said, "the tactical guidance, has that been distributed?" "A summary has been sent to Jagdgeschwader 52 and 53, Mertens said. "Altitude advantage. Avoid sustained low-altitude turning engagements. Do not pursue a diving Airacobra below 1,000 meters." He folded his hands on the table. Whether the pilots read it and whether they follow it are separate questions. This was the heart of it, Dietz thought. This was what kept him at Rechlin reading reports in the rain instead of returning to his unit. A technical evaluation was only as valuable as the change in behavior it produced. The Airacobra's secrets were no longer secrets. Mertens had laid them out in 67 pages of meticulous German prose, had photographed every component, had measured every dimension, had flown the aircraft himself for 2 hours after Dietz's initial test flight, and returned with 4 more pages of notes. The knowledge existed. The question was whether knowledge, in a war this large and this fast and this brutal, could travel quickly enough to matter. On his last evening at Rechlin, Dietz went back to Hangar 7 alone. The aircraft was still on its trestles, though the evaluation was complete. It would remain at the facility as a reference item, available for further study if needed, which Mertens clearly hoped it would be. The hangar was empty of people. lit only by the working lights along the ceiling, and the Airacobra sat in that industrial twilight with the patient quality of machines that had been separated from their purpose. He stood beside it for a long time, not touching it, not examining it, simply standing in the same space with it. The German crosses looked less wrong now, or perhaps he had simply gotten used to them. The automobile door on the left side was closed. The cannon barrel protruded from the nose with its characteristic bluntness. Somewhere east of here, over ground he had flown above for 2 years, pilots were fighting an aircraft like this one. Soviet pilots who had learned, through study and through the brutal education of combat, how to make this unusual machine perform at the outer limit of its design. German pilots who were beginning to learn, some of them too late, that the aircraft they had been dismissing as an American cast-off was something more considered and more dangerous than its origin suggested. He put his hand on the fuselage skin, just once, briefly. The aluminum was cold. "You were not a failure," he said quietly, to the empty hangar and the dead pilot's aircraft. "You were just misunderstood." The winter of 1943 came down over the Eastern Front like a sentence being carried out. The temperatures dropped below -20 by December. The ground froze to iron, and the air battles over the steppe continued with the mechanical indifference of a process that had long since outgrown the capacity of any individual to influence it through understanding alone. Dietz returned to Jagdgeschwader 52 in the second week of November. His Staffel was based at a forward airstrip near Zaporozhye, a collection of dispersal bays cut into frozen earth, fuel trucks buried to their axles in mud that had solidified around them like concrete, and a operations hut that was warm only in the immediate vicinity of its iron stove. He was welcomed back with the particular muted warmth of men who have learned not to invest too much emotion in reunions, because reunions in this place were always temporary. He briefed his pilots on the evaluation findings over the course of 2 evenings, using chalk diagrams on the operations hut wall in the same manner Mertens had used them at Rechlin. He drew the weight distribution diagrams, he explained the drive shaft, he described the roll rate and the turn radius. He talked about the cannon and the centerline mounting and what it meant for deflection shooting in a turning fight. His pilots listened with the attentiveness of men for whom this information had immediate and personal relevance. Several of them had lost colleagues to the Airacobra. Lieutenant Georg Pfeiffer, 22 years old, from Nuremberg, had himself been shot up badly enough over the Dnieper Bend in September to spend 3 weeks in a field hospital with cannon fragments in his left shoulder. He sat through both evenings of briefing with the focused attention of someone taking notes on a subject that had already cost him considerably. "So we stay high," Pfeiffer said, on the second evening, when Dietz had finished. "Always above 3,000 meters against the Airacobra." "If the tactical situation allows it," Dietz said, "which it will not always. The ground forces will call for close support at low altitude, and we will fly it. The Soviets know this, and they will be waiting." "Then what do we do when we meet one below 3,000? Dietz looked at the chalk diagram on the wall for a moment. The simple cross-section of the Airacobra with its centrally mounted engine, the weight distribution arrows, the turn radius comparison he had drawn beside a Gustav. Then he looked at Pfeiffer, at the young man's shoulder where the wound had healed imperfectly, at the slight stiffness in his left arm that would probably never fully resolve. "You do not turn with it," he said. "You extend. You use your speed advantage in the dive. You create separation. You climb back to altitude, and you re-engage on your terms. If you cannot do that, if you are already committed, already in the turn, you make your pass as fast as possible, and you do not slow down for a second shot." He paused. "One pass. That is the rule against a good Airacobra pilot. One pass, and extend." This was simple enough doctrine. Whether it would survive contact with the chaos of actual low-altitude combat over the front lines was another question. and everyone in the room understood this without it needing to be stated. What Dietz did not tell his pilots that evening, because he was not certain it was useful information for men who needed to fly missions in the morning, was what the evaluation at Rechlin had ultimately meant to him at a level beyond tactics and engineering. He had been thinking about it since his last evening in Hangar 7, turning it over during the train journey east, examining it from different angles the way Mertens examined a component, looking for what it actually was rather than what he expected it to be.
The Americans had built an aircraft in the late 1930s based on a set of assumptions about air combat that had turned out to be wrong for their needs. High-altitude escort work, strategic bombing support, the kind of war the United States Army Air Forces were preparing to fight over Western Europe. For all of this, the Airacobra was genuinely inadequate. The Americans had assessed it honestly, found it wanting by their specific criteria, and passed it on. This was not stupidity or failure. It was accurate engineering judgment applied to a specific problem. The Soviets had received the same aircraft and applied different criteria. Their war was low, fast, and brutal. It was fought over river crossings and supply columns and infantry positions, at altitudes where the Allison's supercharger limitation was irrelevant, where the turn radius mattered more than the service ceiling, where a 37mm cannon on the aircraft centerline was the difference between destroying a tank column's air cover in one firing pass and expending ammunition uselessly against armored targets while being shot down from behind. Two different wars, one aircraft, two completely opposite conclusions about its value. And the Germans, Dietz included, he was honest enough to acknowledge this, had looked at the aircraft through the lens of their own assumptions and seen only the limitations the Americans had seen, without perceiving the capabilities the Soviets had found. They had read the intelligence reports about Lend-Lease rejections and felt something close to contempt. A second-rate aircraft passed off on an ally who could not be choosy. This was a comfortable conclusion. It required no revision of existing beliefs. The crash in the marsh near Malaya Rohan had forced a different kind of looking. Mertens' report had been distributed. Tanks engineers at Focke-Wulf had studied the weight distribution data. The tactical guidance had gone to the operational units. These were real outcomes, real transmissions of knowledge from one dead aircraft to the living engineers and pilots of a nation that needed every advantage it could find. But Dietz suspected, with the particular clarity that comes from having been genuinely surprised by something, that the deepest lesson of the Airacobra evaluation was not technical. It was epistemological. It was about the danger of knowing what you expect to find before you look. In the spring of 1944, flying his 141st combat mission over the Crimea, Dietz encountered an Airacobra at 2,800 meters. The Soviet pilot was good. The initial attack came from above and behind with the sun behind him, textbook positioning, and Dietz only saw him because of the shadow that crossed his canopy a half-second before the cannon fire would have arrived. He broke hard right, dived, extended at full throttle for 8 seconds, climbed back to 3,500 meters. By the time he leveled off, the Airacobra was gone, dissolved back into the haze above the peninsula, unwilling to follow him to altitude. One pass, extend, climb. He had written the rule himself. He had followed it. He was alive. In the operations records of Jagdgeschwader 52, the engagement was logged in 3 lines. Enemy aircraft encountered, type P-39. Engagement broken off, no claims, no losses. The 3 lines said nothing about Rechlin, nothing about the marsh near Malaya Rohan, nothing about a dead Soviet pilot's pencil calculations, or an engineer's chalk diagrams, or an automobile door that opened outward on a hinge borrowed from a civilian production line. They said nothing about what it means to look at a thing honestly and see what it is rather than what you expected it to be.
But the pilot who wrote those 3 lines knew, and he flew every subsequent mission with the knowledge sitting behind his ribs like ballast. Steady, heavy, and necessary.
The Cobra had taught him that. Not the living ones, circling above the steppe in the hands of men who had learned to love an aircraft their allies had discarded. The dead one. The one on the trestles in Hangar 7, open to the cold light, giving up its secrets to men willing finally to look